The seeing eye is an ingenious design made by an all-powerful creator. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Proverbs 20:12.
Evolutionists would like us to believe otherwise, but we can see that as impossible, totally impossible. So Dr. Rob Carter, he has a degree in marine biology. He has studied and writes researches on any issue to do with genetics. He's a senior scientist with Creation Ministries International. And if you look at the creation.com website, you'll see many articles that have been written by him, and of course others by Serfetti and other scientists with the organization. So Carter also serves on the board of CRS, which is Creation Research Society, which has been around for, I think, 60 years at this time. And Carter is a member of that board, I think, for the last 8 years. So he's very involved in creation apologetics, and we look forward to hearing from him tonight. Carter?
Thank you to the Apologetics Forum and to this church for allowing me to come here and speak to you. I have a pretty much brand new talk for you. These are ideas that have been bowling around in my head for decades. And after thinking, they kind of congealed into an aha moment. And that's what I'm going to present to you. Species were designed to change. A lot of what I've done in my life scientifically, a lot of these ideas, a lot of other things that CMI produces can be found in the pages of our Creation magazine or on our website, creation.com. So when we're done, I'll just trust that you're going to go to creation.com and look up some question I might raise, because I'm not going to be able to answer everything in one sitting. I know a lot of you are creation groupies, but not all of you are. Some of you might be brand new to this. Some of you might be quite shocked by what you're about to hear. Well, welcome. I'm happy you're here. And for you creation nerds out there, I trust there's something new here that you may not have ever heard before. We also have an email newsletter that I know many of you get. It comes out every Friday. It's basically a compendium of the information that comes out on creation.com every week. And we'll put something interesting in it, something exciting, something informative, maybe a new answer to some evolutionary thing that's in the news. We'll just, real quick, write an article, get it on our website, and it goes out to all our people. If you'd like to sign up for it, it's really easy. We ask for a name, an email address, and a zip code. Easy peasy. Those are going to go around now. Just pass them through the audience as I'm talking, and I'm just going to ignore those guys and start my talk. If you consider what God created in Genesis, He does not give us many details. This is day 6 of creation week. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. That's not a lot of description. We've got livestock, creeping thing, beasts of the earth. That's all the things that live on land. So the Bible is not a taxonomy book. Its intention is not to tell us everything there is to know about biology. The intention of the Bible is to point us to Christ and tell us that we are the bride of Christ and Christ is coming back, etc., etc. It's a theological book, but when it touches science, it should not be wrong. And yet we have this thing in the modern world called taxonomy, where we can, in very fine detail, study living things and group them and split them and decide what's a species and what's not. But the Bible doesn't use modern taxonomy. The Linnaean system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, given to us by the great creationist Carl Linnaeus. Now, I don't follow this anymore either. This is outdated. There are too many problems with this. It's a good rule of thumb, but practical taxonomy cannot follow this, because what do you do when you find a subphylum or a suborder or something like that? And where do you put the protostomes and the deuterostomes in here, the biggest division in the animal kingdom? Not even on this list. We need a better system. The biblical system, though, is very strange. On day 4 of Creation Week, God creates all the flying things. The Hebrews would consider bats a flying thing. Does that mean that the Bible calls bats birds? Were they really that ignorant? Did they not know that bats were mammals? Did they not know the difference? Well, no. The Hebrew word is oph, O-P-H in English, oph. It means things that fly. It's perfectly acceptable to lump all the flying things into a category. I am a marine biologist. We do this all the time. There's a word. You know that stuff that whales eat? Plankton? What's plankton? Well, it's the little things that float in the water. And they can be algae, they could be little animals, they could be crustaceans, baby fish. It's a catch-all category. It's things that float in the water. Just like Hebrews say, things that fly, I say, things that float. And the nekton are the things that swim, and the benthos are the things that are stuck to the bottom. We marine biologists use a very Hebrew-like taxonomy as we're discussing things. But did you catch that quote that I read? It kept saying, after their kind. So the Bible is describing God creating discrete categories that reproduce within themselves and not with other categories. But he didn't tell us where the line was between the categories. Didn't tell us how many. Didn't tell us how many individuals within each category, what their differences were. And that's where we as creationists can approach the living world and say, this is amazing and fun. I love taxonomy. Because we're looking at what God created. And God's a really complicated God. And taxonomy reflects that in strange ways. Well, the word kind in Hebrew is min. The word create is bara. So someone has coined a term, a baramin or a baramin, a created kind. Throughout the rest of this talk, I'm going to be trying to define what a created kind is, not a species. Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species. What's a species? As a biologist, I really can't even define it. One definition is things that breed true to type. So lions are a species. But Ernst Mayr, the evolutionist, came up with a biological species definition, which I really like a lot. If two things can interbreed, they're the same species. So lions and tigers are the same species. Oh. And geologists use a totally different definition. A geologist look at something dead in the rocks. They don't know if these things can breed or not. They don't know if they breed true to type, if they can hybridize with other species. They have no idea. It's dead. And they say, this one looks a little different than this other one. I'll call them different species. So what's a species? It's a subdivision of a baramin. God creates a reproductive class, a group of organisms that can reproduce with each other. And if they get separated, if they're divided up into discrete populations, or in case of birds, even though we know they can hybridize, they tend not to because the female birds seek out a mate that sang like their father. Weird. So bird species are based on behavior, not genetics. What's a species? How many are there? Well, I think a better creationist approach to this is not to talk about species at all, to talk about baramins and watch a species derive from them. Because Darwin said, oh, look at that. Species change. What do you know? You Christians are wrong. What? Now, the church at the time had adopted Aristotle's view that species are inflexible, invariant. That's not true. And Darwin showed that. He thought he was knocking the Bible off its pedestal. No, he's knocking down Aristotle. But most people in the church, because they elevated Aristotle to almost godlike status, it was a big thing to attack Aristotle. Evolutionists have been struggling with this for a long time. In Science magazine a couple years ago, an article finally shaking up the tree of life. And this article documented all these hybridizations between different species and different genera, sometimes in different families. And Elizabeth Panisi, she basically has an editorial in every science. She goes, why are we only now discovering massive amounts of hybridization between species? It's because the Darwinists had blinders on and they were refusing to accept the obvious. They had the evidence for 200 years and they didn't want to admit it. That's why. Because the reality, the Barrowman concept is a better reality. Species are ephemeral. Species come and they go. They appear and they blend in with other species and poof, they're gone. I've written a lot about this. I wrote a 3-part article series on creation.com called Species Were Designed to Change, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. I also filmed some YouTube videos that I posted on my channel, biblicalgenetics.com, and parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. The third part was so fun and detailed, I split it up into 2 20-minute videos. There's some amazing stuff out there. I'm summarizing those 3 articles and those 4 videos in this talk. But it's only a summary. There's a lot more details that you can dig into. And I'm telling you what, this is one of my favorite subjects. I started writing about this. I said, this is so cool. You know, there's an example of species changing in the Bible. You know it. You've read it. You've been perplexed by it. Remember when Jacob peeled those sticks? And he put them in front of the troughs when the sheep came to breed. Have you ever wondered what on earth that's talking about? Did Jacob believe in sympathetic magic? If I put peeled sticks in front of these things, they're going to come out striped. No. In fact, the wood that he used, a lot of them have medicinal things. You peel certain willow barks and you get aspirin in your water. I mean, he used medicinal woods. I don't think there'd be enough of it. And people have argued what the sticks mean. You know, did he put a sheepskin over the sticks, or was the stick there to trap the ewes? There's all these arguments. Put that aside. His father-in-law, Laban, had not given him any pay. He gave him 2 wives, a bunch of sons. Okay, great, but no pay. And Jacob says one day, father-in-law of mine, I know you're a trickster and I know you've lied and cheated me all these years, but I want to get paid for my efforts. But all I want is all the streaked and speckled sheep and goats in the flocks. You can have all the pure white ones you want. They're yours, all the speckled ones are mine. So Laban says, okay. And he takes all the speckled ones out of the flock, gives them to his sons, and they go 3 days away. So Jacob's sitting there with an all-white flock. But he knew 2 things that Laban didn't know. One, God had revealed to him in a dream what he should do. 2, he knew that white sheep can breed dark lambs. Because as a good animal husbandman, he'd been living with these animals for years. In fact, he knew that the stronger rams, when they bred, would pop out with babies that were speckled and, colored in some way. There's something about hybrid vigor here that he knew. He didn't know that word. But he knew that those guys produce these types of sheep, and they're the better rams, and those rams produce only white sheep, and they're the worst rams. So he partitioned his flock, and he only allowed some of them to breed. And very shortly, he had massive flocks with color in their fur, and Laban had nothing. And he complained, you've cheated me. He's like, you cheated me. So if you ever wondered about that, the reason why this is true is because in sheep and goats, a dark color is recessive, not dominant. In humans, dark colors are dominant. In sheep and goats, they're recessive. So those traits can be hidden in that population. And all of a sudden, we have an answer to the problem. Jacob's Livestock on creation.com, and one of my most popular videos I've ever done, Jacob's Livestock Breeding Experiment on YouTube or on biblicalgenetics.com. Now, Aristotle said that species don't change over time. And a lot of evolutionists claim that creationists believe the species don't change over time, which is not true. In fact, the creationists before Charles Darwin were talking about species changing and natural selection, all sorts of other things like that. But people have this idea that we believe in a lawn, like each species is a blade of grass with no branches. On the contrary side, you've probably seen depictions of the tree of life all living species going back to a common ancestor. They call it Luca, the last universal common ancestor. Did you see the Disney cartoon Luca? The bike race is going to save the world. That's stupid. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, the Luca, the fish thing that turned into a human when it came on land, I am certain they used Luca on purpose because it's an evolutionary word. Just saying. But we have this idea that all species go back in time to a common ancestor, the evolutionary view. Now, the creationists do not believe in a lawn, more like an orchard or a forest. That God creates individual kinds, and from each kind, species can derive over time. I don't believe that anymore. I'm going to take that orchard and put it on steroids. You can't depict the kinds in 2 dimensions. You need 3 dimensions. You might need 4 dimensions. I was clued in on this in a book that I got when I was in graduate school, and I was so excited about this book. This coral reef scientist, J.E.N. Verone, very famous coral reef scientist, and he was trying to figure out the fossil record of corals versus the modern record of corals, and which corals can hybridize and which can't within families. So like one of the most common corals in the Caribbean, they're called acroporids. There's like 800 species. There's 3 in the Caribbean, there's 800 in the Pacific. They're all over the place, they dominate the reefs, and yet you look at them and you have a really hard time telling one species from another. 2 things can look identical and yet they can't hybridize. 2 things that look different and they can hybridize. And if you take the ones off this reef and transport them to another reef, they can hybridize, but they look different, or they can't. And sometimes you can have things that it's the same. If you take a coral and break it apart and glue it to different parts of the reef, it'll grow completely different shapes depending on how deep it is, how much wave action there is. And then you look in the fossil record and you're like, that's an acroporid. Yep, sure is. I have no idea what species it is. And then you look at a different place in the fossil record, you're like, whoa, that looks like halfway between that species and that species. And so he came up with this idea of a ladder-like system where you have, let me turn on my laser pointer. You have modern species, but then as you go back in time, that species definition is no longer true. You have different groupings of traits. And as you go back in time, it ebbs and flows until you get to the ancestors of the modern ones. If you hand me, I probably can't do it anymore, but there's one point in time where if you handed me any coral, I would tell you what family it belonged to. This is 9 different coral families. They're different. The mushroom corals, a acroporid up there, or that's a apologetics. You got a paritid, you have a mucid, and they're very characteristic. And a little bit of training, it is obvious that these are different from one another, but you have to look really close. They just grow different. Some of them, the new polyps form in between polyps. Some of them, the current polyps bud, and they divide in half as they grow. Very simple. You look at that, oh, that totally separates from one family to another. And they're consistent throughout the whole fossil record. The funny thing is these guys just appear suddenly, poof. In the evolutionary scheme, before the time of the dinosaurs. Out of nothing, all of a sudden, all these families of corals appear, and they're still with us today. They never changed. The species are flexible. This is a great candidate for a biblical created kind. Or these are great candidates for biblical created kinds. Now I'm going to show you a diagram. I actually divided the kinds into 4 different types. Type 1, let me explain this diagram to you. This on the vertical axis is time. I took 3 slices through time, 1 at creation, 1 at the flood, and 1 today. The axes can be anything you like. Color, height, width, weight, whatever you like. This could be describing wolves or badgers or honeybees. And you just put some traits, stripes or no stripes, whatever you want on the axes. But what I'm depicting here is something that God created only a few of initially. And that population grows until the time of the flood, where the flood wipes out most of them and only a few survive. And over the next 4,500 years, they grow into another large population. And there might be some side groups that either branch off and go extinct or branch off and merge back into the population that we see in archaeology or in the fossil record. Now, I call this a type 1 created kind. This is humans. God created 2 humans. That's the only Barrowmen that God actually numbered. We don't know how many oak trees he created. I imagine more than 2. He spread them out across the world. He definitely created more than 2 E. coli. Adam and Eve would have had billions of them just in themselves, but every warm-blooded animal would have had E. coli. I expected he created much more than 2 elephants. I don't know, but it's a possibility. Adam named all the animals that were in the garden, but it doesn't mean that there were not those same animals out there. Or if he took 2 dog-like things, called them dogs, then he leaves the garden, he walks around maybe 100 years later, whoa, that's a dog. It just looks a lot different than the one I saw at first, because God could have put genetic diversity across the world in the Barrowmen. Not true for humans. 2 humans. Now in this model, this might be Homo erectus. This might be Neanderthal, which clearly emerged back into the human population, because Neanderthals are Homo sapiens, human beings. I think Homo erectus is also Homo sapiens. We just don't have any DNA from them yet. That okay? Yeah. My three-dimensional diagram is okay? It took me forever to... I did this on PowerPoint, and I'm not a graphic artist. So forgive my rudimentary skills. That's the best I could do. But there's other types of Barrowmens. Here's a Barrowman that God probably created lots of, but only put a little bit of genetic diversity into them. At the flood, many of them died. A few of them lived. Now, trilobites, they all died at the flood, and the amount of diversity in trilobites is shocking. There's thousands of species. It is bewildering how many species of those things there are. But horseshoe crabs, not so much. The horseshoe crabs, you have horseshoe crabs around here? Where I grew up, they're all over the bay in New York. They're not here? Wow, these are totally common, saw them all the time. And they look just like they did in the fossil record. Almost no difference. Type 2 Barrowmen. Something God creates, either many of or only a few of, it doesn't matter, but there's only a little bit of genetic diversity. Now there's no line between these two. There's going to be Barrowmens in between my type 1 and type 2. But I'm categorizing in big pictures so we can get these things in our mind. A type 3, actually, the whole reason I wrote these papers was to get to this point. The complicated ones. Imagine God created something like a barnacle. I know you have barnacles here. And imagine that these barnacles only live in cold water on rocky coastlines, like the waters around here. And imagine that south of us, there's no Oregon, there's just sand. So there's no rocky coastline south of us. And there's nothing in Alaska. It's all sand up there also. So there's no rocky coastline. And these barnacles only live in your bay only. Now imagine that there's only a couple of other places in the world where they can survive. Maybe Southern Australia and Ireland. That's it. So God creates 4 or 5 distinct pockets of these barnacles that are the same created kind, but they cannot reach each other, so they cannot reproduce with each other. But each pocket can have different genetics. And over time, because of selection and drift, the genetics of that population is going to change a little bit. Now, if one of these happens to get attached to a branch and floats across the ocean and makes it to Tasmania, where the other barnacles are, then they can start hybridizing. And all of a sudden, you can get an influx of genes that were not in that original population. And when they come in, new phenotypes, new forms can appear. That species can change. And the fossil records would be like, what on earth is this? It's just a Barrowman interacting with each other. And so over time, you can start off at creation with maybe this is the width of the barnacle, and this is the height of the barnacle. So you can have narrow short ones, narrow tall ones, wide short ones, wide tall ones, and something in between. And then maybe they grow, this one goes extinct, And these populations do meet and merge at the flood, but then only a couple of them survive the flood, and so we have these things. But look, see this guy up here? Instead of being short and narrow, it's now narrow and tall. They morphed. And that's okay. And we would call that a different species. And it's okay, because species are only subdivisions of a Barrowman. All of a sudden, everything that Charles Darwin talked about fits into creationism. There's a fourth type of Barrowman. There are not many of them. They're the asexual organisms, the purely asexual organisms. Even bacteria are not asexual. Bacteria share genes. They will suck DNA up out of the environment and try the genes on to see how they fit. And that's why you get like antibiotic resistance skipping between different species, because bacteria will try genes. But there are some asexual species. Even the water flea Daphnia is not purely asexual, but it's the one we study in biology, and they say it's asexual. It's essentially each individual is its own Barrowman. They're only females. They produce eggs that only produce females. There are no males in that species. Each individual only reproduces itself. And so these are strange, they're uncommon, but a type 4 Barrowman is going to survive or not over time, and it is just each individual is an individual. And that's really cool and weird, and it's hard to understand because we're not like that. But there's your 4 types. You okay with that so far? All right, let's change gears here. Let's talk about how species change. It's hard to even say that. It's how Barrowmans change, but it's not really how Barrowmans change. It's how the groups within the Barrowmans change, which we call species. It's really hard for me to figure out the wording to use, but let's just say how species change. There are several important ways. One, God obviously created more than 2 beetles. Beetles are very important in the world for recycling leaves and things like that, and he would have created gazillions of beetles. I don't think I'm going out on a limb and saying that. Within those beetles, who knows how much genetic diversity he could put in there? Tons and tons and tons. And through the normal process of sexual reproduction, genes get shuffled every generation, and 2 beetles could literally, that look the same, can produce something that doesn't look like the parents, given that sort of a situation. A lot of the evolutionists will laugh at the creationists because God would have had to put millions of species on the ark, and they're usually referring to beetles. But beetles didn't have to be on the ark at all. And even if they were, a front-loaded beetle with a lot of genetic diversity could create a lot of beetle species pretty quickly through inbreeding and things like that. So God front-loading his creation means lots of diversity can unfold over time. I love using that word because you know what the word evolution means? It means unfolding. I just stole it. Diversity can unfold over time. There's a second huge way that diversity can appear, and it's through recombination. Now imagine God creates dogs, and they're big, muscular, slobbery dogs. And in these dogs, there's 2 genes right next to each other on the chromosome. One of them codes for height. If you have a big T, that's for tall, little t is short. Big M is for muscular, little m is skinny. So tall and muscular, short and skinny. And there's only 2 versions of these chromosomes in that original dog population. Whether you created 2 dogs or 1,000 dogs, doesn't matter. There's only 2 versions of those 2 genes. But what if the little t and little m is rare? All the original dogs could have been big and muscular, and yet the ability to produce a chihuahua might have been sitting in that population. God might never have produced or created a chihuahua. And maybe hundreds of years later, Adam would be like, what is that? That's not a dog. That came from what? Because that gene combination can be floating around in the population. And if it's rare, it might be a long time before both parents are hybrids, and just 1 out of 4 possibility that they pass little t and little m on both copies to that dog. So you could have spontaneous stuff just appearing out of nowhere if God front-loads the genomes with that. But that's my first example. Let's talk about crossing over. Because in sexual reproduction, the chromosomes within an organism, there are 1 or 2 crossovers per chromosome arm per generation. The closer 2 genes are together, the less likely recombination is going to happen between them. So you have 2 closely linked genes, it might be thousands of years before recombination happens and scrambles, and now all of a sudden we can have a chromosome with a tall, skinny, or a short, muscular. God did not create those. He created the capacity for those to occur. His foreknowledge and brilliance, he front-loaded potential information that wasn't realized until recombination happens. So now all of a sudden we have to use this thing called the Punnett square, which if you haven't had biology, you will. If you haven't had biology 50 years, you just have to remember. We have to write all the different combinations of the genes that come from the father and the mother, and you could have big T, big M, big T, little t, big M, or little t, little m. If you have at least one big T and at least one big M, because T and M are dominant, it doesn't matter what the other copy is, and you're going to be a big Mastiff-like dog in gray. If you have the little copies of both of them, you're going to be like a Chihuahua. But all of a sudden, we have the ability to make a tall, skinny dog, like an Irish Wolfhound, or a short, muscular dog, like a bulldog, through recombination. There's no telling how much diversity is still within the living world. Recombination events that simply haven't happened yet. How many species are possible? Who knows? Tons. There's another way you can get genetic diversity. There are pieces of your genome that will pop out of your genome, float around, and stick somewhere else. It happens in your brain. When you're developing in your mother, these little pieces, they're called retrotransposons, they're popping around in the genome of your brain cells and changing the genetics of your brain cells. They're literally turning genes on and turning genes off. Your brain cells have different genomes. But have you ever seen Indian corn? The reason all those kernels have different colors is because of retrotransposons. And if a retrotransposon gets in a position and breaks, it can't jump around anymore, and all of a sudden you have nothing but yellow corn kernels or nothing but white corn kernels. The plant can't do anything but produce that because the retrotransposon can't move. And they're in animals, they're in plants, and as those things are jumping around, they're changing the phenotype, the way the animal or plant looks or behaves or reacts. You okay with that? There's a fourth way. Pre-planned mutations. There are some genes that if you change it, you die. Literally, they are invariant across the entire animal world because that gene, you can't change it. There are other genes, if you change it, it doesn't matter hardly at all. And the skin and eye color and coat color genes in animals is one of the classic hypervariable genes. Because you can be whatever skin color you want, and it doesn't matter. You can survive just fine. And a lot of times, the genes that are variable are the genes that turn on at the end of development. The genes that turn on while you're developing, if you change those, you die. And it's really funny because Darwinism needs the developmental genes to change to get different body plans. Who cares about the end ones? But Darwin only focused on the ones he could see, which are the ones that God allowed to change. He didn't have to do that. He could have coded the melanin-producing genes. He could have hard-coded them so they're invariant. He could have written it so that a mutation would not change the amino acids. But if he chose other letters, if that C becomes a T, that's the most common mutation in the genome is a C to T. If I put this 3-letter combination, which is going to code for that amino acid, well, if that changes to a T, then it changes the amino acid. But if I use this 3-letter code, if that changes to a T, I keep the same amino acid. He coded this to be highly variable. And it's no big deal. And this is what Darwinism focuses on. It focuses on the trivial, and it can't explain the important. Change can also come through inbreeding. Inbreeding leads to a lack of genetic diversity, loss of genetic diversity. There's some shocking levels of inbreeding in the Bible. This is the family tree of Terah. the father of Abraham and Sarah. They're the parents of Jacob. He married Rebekah, who's his first cousin once removed and first cousin twice removed, times 2. Yuck. They gave birth to Jacob, who married his first cousins Rachel and Leah, who are much closer than first cousins because he also descends from their, oh yuck. You know how you have 50% of each of your mother's and father's DNA? You have 1/4 of your grandparents, therefore it's what? 50, 25, 12 and a half, 6 and a half, 3. By the time you get down to the 12 sons of Jacob, if you follow the longest branch up to Terah, they should have about 1.5 or 1.25% of Terah's genome. But because he inherited pieces of his genome through all these different directions, they have 22% of his genome. And because of the laws of genetics, it's highly likely that a lot of that they have 2 identical copies of large sections of their genome where there's no variation. So if there's a gene in there that affects height or weight or curliness of the hair, shape of the nose, color of the skin, all the brothers could very likely share identical copies of it. So you could be walking down the streets of some ancient village and pick out an Israelite from the crowd because they're going to look different after that much inbreeding. But this is happening in essentially every little village across the world. Most people in history married someone who was born less than 5 miles away from where they were born. In fact, most people married their first cousin. Charles Darwin married his first cousin. She had multiple brothers and sisters, and each one of them also married first cousins. It's really dumb to marry your cousin, but it was also very common in history. Inbreeding leads to a loss of genetic diversity, and a recipe for inbreeding is in the Bible after the Tower of Babel. Because when God separated that population into independent groups, as they spread out, they're not going to be able to interbreed with the others. That inbreeding in each little group is going to cause a loss of genetic diversity, and all of a sudden we have a perfect recipe for the spontaneous origin of races after Noah's flood. We don't need millions of years. We don't even need natural selection. We just need non-random mating in small groups of people. There's another way you can get change over time, and that's through individual choice. Yeah, that white rabbit might get picked off by a hawk if it's hopping around in this dark grass. But then again, the white rabbit might say, you know what, I think I'll be more comfortable in that snowbank over there. And he hops over there. And the brown rabbit say, you know what, I like it better over here in the dirt. And they hop over there. Well, the white rabbits over there are going to find other white rabbits, and the brown rabbits over here are going to find other brown rabbits, and all of a sudden you have a partitioning of the population because they hopped in different directions because they chose to. You don't even need natural selection for this. Now, natural selection might apply because if that rabbit is living here in the summertime, there's no snowbank for him, and it's going to die. But it lives up in Alaska, maybe it's got a better chance of finding a place to hide in the summertime. Just saying. All right, so those are all my ways of species changing over time. They're built into the system. Now let's talk about the environment a moment. Because environment is not static. Even in Eden, if Adam and Eve had never fallen, the environment would still have changed over time. Because if there's a river, there's erosion. If there's erosion, you have sediment building up and downstream. You're going to get river deltas growing. You're going to get land growing. If there's an ocean, you're going to get erosion on the shore, and the shoreline is going to change over time. If there's a pond, you're going to get plants growing in the pond. The plant material is going to fall to the bottom of the pond. The mud's going to get thicker and thicker and thicker, and the pond's going to silt in and turn into land. The frogs are going to have to hop away, go downstream and find another pond to live in. Given even slow erosion, over millions of years, even with no death or suffering, if Adam and Eve had not fallen, there's still going to be environmental change. Therefore, species are going to have to adapt to different environments over time. Therefore, even in Eden, if Adam and Eve, or even in the future heaven and earth when God recreates the world, I expect change to occur. Oh, that's fun. But even on local system, environments are not static. When an elephant eats a tree, it exposes the forest floor to a patch of light that wasn't there before that changes the birds, the animals, the insects, and the plants that live there. Temporarily until a new tree grows up. but the environment is constantly ebbing and flowing. And so if there's an earthworm population or ladybug population in the forest, well, they might not like the light, they'll move. Or they might like the light and they'll be attracted to it. And the whole ecology of the system is going to change over time on local and on global levels. One more example. I'm actually going to wrap up with this example. And we'll have some time for questions and answers. Imagine that there is a mountain. And the mountain is covered in oak trees. And the top of the mountain doesn't get much rain. It's very dry up there. But the bottom of the mountain, there's a river, and it's really swampy down there. And one species of oak tree living on this mountain in two very different environments. Now imagine that within this oak tree population, there are different genes. And some of the genes help the oak trees tolerate dry roots. And the oak trees with those genes grow faster than the ones that like wet roots in a dry environment. But on the other side of the mountain, down the bottom there, the oak trees that have genes that help them to tolerate wet roots grow very well. But the ones that have the genes that like dry roots don't grow nearly as fast. They're not dying. This is not a life and death thing. It's not natural selection in Darwinian terms. It's they grow faster or not. Everyone's happy. They're just not growing as fast. But larger trees produce more acorns, right? So over time, when an elephant comes and eats a tree and opens a patch of ground and a new tree grows up, what acorns are more likely to be ready to sprout in a swampy area? Well, acorns with the genes that like wet roots, because those trees have produced more acorns there. But if the elephant goes on top of the mountain and eats a tree, now we're going to have a new tree sprout up. What acorns are more likely to be ready to sprout? Well, the ones produced by the trees that like dry roots. So over thousands of years on this mountain, you're going to get a partitioning of the genes. The trees down on the bottom are going to grow different. They're going to grow buttress roots. They're going to have different ring patterns than the ones up top. They're going to look different. We would call them different species, but they're the same species. In fact, the funny thing about oak trees is there are a lot of hybrids. Not between red oaks and white oaks, but all the red oaks can hybridize and all the white oaks can hybridize. And I used to own a sawmill, and I sawed up a lot of oak trees, and I always tried to identify the species, and I found it impossible. Because I lived, my land was on a stream in an old area of a forest with weird things that should grow further north in the Appalachians, and I kept finding these plants in my little ecotope. And I was like, what is this? And then I cut down the tree and like, what is this tree? I don't know what this tree is. Because of weird hybrids. Because they're the same baramin, but different species. And what's a species? It's a subdivision of a baramin, and species are ephemeral. Baramins are what God created. And then biology gets really fun and really strange after that. So your takeaways. 1, species were designed by our intelligent God to change. But the changes are in a box. You cannot exceed the design specifications. Oak trees cannot get 6,000 feet tall. They break. There are limits to change, and they're physical limits based on what God programmed into those baramins. There's also a problem with probability. We only have thousands of years, and even if there are millions of oak trees, and that's lots of mutation, that might not have been enough time for every recombination of every single gene in the oak tree genome. There might be other trees waiting to pop out in the future. We just haven't seen them yet. And so therefore, the time is also something putting these in a box. Given millions of years, which I don't think Christ is going to wait that long, but given millions of years, we can expect to see many more species appear and disappear. But I do not expect any baramins to morph into another baramin. I do not expect baramins to reproduce with each other, because the fundamental unit of creation is the baramin. But I just gave you a bunch of theoretical stuff. I don't know a lot of answers. That literally came down out of outer space for some of you. We need more people to think critically on these issues. We need young people to get into biology. We need people to write and conceive and run computer models and do ecological experiments and try to figure out what God created. Because back in the early 1800s, we had no clue. And the church was caught flat-footed when Darwin started saying species change. You know, he got more support from the church than he did from the scientists. A lot more support. The people trained in philosophy supported Darwin's philosophy, and the people who were trying to do empirical science did not. That's really funny. So let's return that. Let's do some more empirical science and challenge Darwin, because I think we got them on the back foot. They don't know it because they don't listen to us. But we have some powerful arguments, and they don't see it coming. And when you talk about stuff like this with them, they're like, what? You're crazy. What? And they just start insulting you because they don't have a rational response, especially when they realize that all their evidence of evolution fits perfectly, comfortably, and happily within creationism. So we get to say, thank you, Mr. Evolutionist, for inventing that. You can go play with something else now. That's mine. As I said earlier, a lot of what I just said is or has appeared in the pages of Creation magazine, on our Journal of Creation, in our creation.com, on our books, our DVDs. Now, I know some of you have heard a lot of creation stuff before, but some of you haven't. So for you people who've been around a while, give me a second here, because I had to tell the other people about one of the most fantastic resources that CMI produces. I think this is the thing that God used to keep me in Christianity when I was 18 and 19 years old. My Christianity was hanging by a thread. I was a full-ball evolutionist. Evolution was a fact. The universe is billions of years old. You've got to be dumb to believe anything else. That's what I was saying. And someone dragged me to a creation conference in Atlanta. I was at Georgia Tech. I think I was a sophomore. And I didn't believe the guy up on the stage. Now I am that guy up on the stage. But I remember getting Creation magazine and bringing it back to my dorm room and being shocked because one of those articles was something I had learned in biology class the day before. And I didn't know the Bible could answer it. And the next page was something in geology that I always wondered about. I said, I didn't know the Bible could answer that. And page after page, edition after edition, this has been a significant factor in my Christian walk. So I'm happy to offer this to you. Now, CMI gives two different versions. We have a 1-year subscription and a 2-year subscription. We're going to pass around a sign-up form in a moment. You just check off 1 year or 2 year and then put your address down there because we do have to mail it to you. If you sign up for a 2-year subscription, we're also going to include the digital version of our magazine. We'll send you an email with a link, and we'll let you share that with anyone you like. Now, we say 5 people, but we don't count, so share it with as many people as you like. It's there for you to read. You can do. I've read it on my phone, my tablet, my PC, anything you like. You can get it read and get other people to read it also. I'm also going to throw in 2 DVDs. One is called Darwin, the Voyage Shook the World. So we spent about $1 million on this in honor of Charles Darwin's 200th birthday. We went around the world following Darwin's footsteps, and we interviewed a bunch of evolutionists and a bunch of creationists. We went to Galapagos Islands, all over South America. We went to his home in England. We wanted to do a fair analysis of the man Darwin, because if you want to understand evolution, you have to understand Darwin. Actually, if we redid this, we would have been a lot harsher. A lot harsher, and it would be fair to be harsher. I mean, did you know that when he was 29 years old, he had a collapse, and he became agoraphobic and never wanted to leave his house again? He died in his 70s. Oh, that's just the beginning of it. I'm also going to include a mini documentary we made called Fallout. We went around to a whole bunch of college campuses around Atlanta, and we interviewed about 200 or 300 students, and we asked them 3 simple questions. Did you go to church while you were growing up? If they said no, we said, see ya. If they said yes, we said, were you ever taught anything about creation and evolution? And then we said, do you still go to church? And wow, that opened up a lot of very interesting conversations. We caught their comments, put it on film. That's a really cool presentation. You can get that with a 2-year subscription. Okay, guys, you can do that now. After that, I'm going to probably recommend this red book, the Creation Answers book. We wrote that to answer 99% of the questions we get, on purpose, to answer 99% of the questions, like, how do you get starlight here from outer space? What's Neanderthal? What about carbon dating? All those things we answer there. We also have a pack called the Starter Pack. It comes with the Creation Answers book, the #1 best-selling creation evolution book ever written called Refuting Evolution. A little book, but that's powerful. And it comes with a DVD. Here's Evolution's Achilles Heels, the book and the documentary. I'm very proud of this. We have won 2 awards at Christian film festivals for a documentary. At the San Antonio Independent Christian Film Festival, there were 13 Christian documentaries submitted, and we were 2nd place. I'm like, yeah, we lost to Mike Huckabee. It's like, oh, just, I was very proud of that showing. This was literally 3 years of work went into this. It is the most powerful thing CMI's ever done. Here's Biblical Geology 101, which happily for me, but not for you, we have sold out of already. It's a new book that I wrote with Mike Ord, just explaining the rocks and the fossils and flood history. That was a fun book to write. I'm right now halfway through Biblical Biology 101. But I'm in the middle of taxonomy section and I'm nerding out and I'm just writing too much, so I just got to stop. Anyway, here's The Deep Time Deception by Mike Ord. I edited this book. I was very happy with this. If you want to know where the millions of years idea comes from and how to answer it, some great stuff in there. How Noah's flood shaped our earth, talks about the shape of the earth, the rocks and things like that. Good stuff there. The Genesis Academy is a 12-part DVD series on the first 11 chapters. I wrote a study guide. If you go to creation.com, just type in study guide. All of our study guides will pop up. I wrote this one. This is the most modern thing we've done. We built a sound stage in our warehouse to film this. It took 2 years for 12 presentations. It's polished, very well done. In fact, in our sound stage, we're about to break ground on a 6-part DVD of the history of Egypt. Now that we have a sound stage, we might as well use it. Woo-hoo-hoo. And I get to go back to Egypt again. Yeah. Anyway. We also have some kids' books out there. Exploring Geology with Mr. Hibb is a great one. I learned stuff in this book I didn't know. This is actually an adult book, but it's got a cricket so we can understand it. Shh, don't tell the kids. Anyway, this little cricket's going around the world looking at rocks and fossils and minerals and things and answering them biblically. And it's really good stuff in there. That was so popular, we wrote a 2nd one called Exploring Dinosaurs with Mr. Hibb, also on the table. We have a 3rd one coming out soon. And I'm trying to convince the boss to do Exploring the Solar System with Mr. Hibb. But he can't figure out, he gets Mr. Hibb out into space and no. He hops on a probe that's going to all the planets accidentally. Come on, you can do this. But I haven't sold him on it yet. I think that'd be a great one. The High-Tech Cell is my favorite talk I've ever given in my life. I'm trying to describe how the human genome works, but no one understands how it works because it's too complicated. You know, if life were simple, evolution might be possible. Life is incredibly complicated. And when we look into the genome, we see the most complicated computer operating system ever seen. We don't even understand it because we don't program computers like that. And the computer analogy is a great analogy used there. We also have a streaming service on our website. In fact, the first one that we ever released is called The Historical Atom, Theological Conundrums and Scientific Implications. I actually produced that for my Biblical Genetics channel, but Gary liked it so much he stole it. Okay, whatever. So I'm happy that it's there. It's also free, and you can watch that anytime you like. Y chromosome stuff, genetics, a lot of fun. I will leave you with this. 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. I tried to model that. I didn't call Darwin an idiot. He was a weirdo, but he wasn't stupid. I didn't insult evolutionists, but I did triumphantly say that they're wrong. Because we've got Scripture. We can stand tall on the Bible. Not just stand on the Bible. We could stand on Scripture confidently and competently and defend it, even though the hostile world is thinking that we're dumb. We're not. And we've got God on our side. Let me end in a prayer. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the beautiful world that you created. Thank you for the biological world that you created. We are in awe. The complexity, the beauty, the species, the way things happen and change, the information you put into things that just makes us wonder. Thank you for making it hard. Because as we learn more about it, all we can do is fall to our knees and say, glory to God. You are an amazing creator. Keep us humble. Keep us searching. Keep us focused on you. And help us always to rejoice in the world that you made for us. And even if we're on this world for only a short time, help us to make the most of our time. To take all the gifts you've given us and just throw them at your feet and say, Lord, do with them as you will. Amen. All right, we got time for questions. Heinz has a microphone, but there's a couple of rules I need to put in place.
Okay, so if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone around, and I know one person has a question here. I'm sure there's others. Think of questions you might want to ask.
But before we ask any questions, let me say what the rules are. There are a number of questions that will divide this audience unnecessarily. And I don't want to be tempted to answer a question that might contradict something this church preaches from this pulpit. That would not be fair of me. So can we steer away from end times theology, King James Bible, free will versus predestination, modes of baptism? No. Scientific questions are fair game. Please make them end in a question mark. No stories. Sometimes you hand a person a microphone. In fact, sometimes I say to the person, don't let go of the microphone. Because every once in a while, you just get someone who goes off. So we're mature enough to handle this, right? Okay, yes we are. Mark.
I've never been called a creation groupie before, but I'll wear it with a badge of like a badge of honor. Okay. I'm online debating and witnessing to evolutionists all the time, and I see a lot of misconceptions there that relate to what you've been talking about. One of them is just the basic idea that all the genetic data science that we look at, creationists have a top-down view of that, whereas the evolutionists have a bottom-up view of it. So you get two completely different worldviews looking at the very same stuff. But when we look at the diversification in that, in a sense, creationists believe in more diversity than
more rapid change,
because all of this happened since the flood, 4,500 years ago or so. Wow, what an explosion of diversity. So in light of what you have been talking about, could you speak to that?
Sure.
And maybe throw in something about epigenetics?
Oh yeah, I didn't even talk about epigenetics. That would open up another avenue of exploration. And the evolutionists jump on us sometimes because they claim that we believe in hyper-evolution. That is not true. In fact, if you start with the created kinds, if they are at the family level, not necessarily that they are always at the family level, but if they're at the level of the family, most vertebrate animals have a few species. 2 species of elephants, 4 or 5 species of bears, 1 species of platypus. There's not that many species within each Barrowman. Now, butterflies, lots. Beetles, lots. But then again, they didn't even have to be on the ark. So who knows how many survived the flood? There could have been a gazillion of them that survived the flood and went on with all their genetic diversity to populate the world again. There are some creationists who think that whales were on the ark. No. These are serious college professors at Christian colleges. I know their names. Because the fossil record, whales appear very quickly, and there's some whales that look like they have half legs and some that don't, and they appear right after where they think the flood boundary is, which they think it's at the end of the dinosaur era. Then you get whales. So they said, well, whales are on the ark, and very quickly they morphed into swimming things. That's too much change for me. That's beyond my model. And I cannot mathematically defend that. Plus, my flood boundary is much higher in the fossil record. So I skip over all that whale evolution. That's just God created whales and Pakicetas, which is kind of halfway in between. That's fine. God could do whatever he wants. Have I answered this yet? Do you want more than that?
Yeah.
Okay, go back. Ask the question briefly again with the question mark. Let me see if I can jump in again.
Well, just how do you get so much diversity in 4,500 years?
Okay. Okay, how do you get so much diversity in 4,500 years? Depends on what Barrowman you're talking about. Platypuses and echidnas, no diversity. Coelacanths, a little bit of diversity. Birds. Birds, there's a huge range. The finches. If you look at all the birds, like perching birds are half the species and all the other birds are not. And within the perching birds, a huge proportion of those are finches. Well, I just saw an article, there was a hybridization between a grosbeak and a something else. And it's hopping around perfectly happy. These are two different families of birds. They said these things have been separated for 20 million years. How can they hybridize? Well, because they're the same created kind. Now, there's another question. I don't like this one. It's possible that Noah didn't know the boundary between kinds, or the kinds in the garden aren't the same as the kinds on the ark. Yeah, one of my friends is arguing that. I don't like that. But if Noah brings 2 of each kind of bird, just 2 finches? Or did it bring canaries and cardinals? Which theoretically could be the same kind. I don't know. So and birds too, the way their genes recombine are different than ours. They get a lot more randomization than we do. So they can speciate more quickly. They also have this strange thing about the bird song, that birds will partition themselves. Even though they can hybridize, they don't. Living in the same forest because of the bird song thing. So they've got an additional level of partitioning that dogs don't have, horses don't have. The amount of diversity we see, most of it is trivial. Almost all of it's trivial. There's only a couple of examples where there are a lot of species, but even then we can see them hybridizing. So we have to look at the genetic system of each system like that, and I think there's something about birds just lets them speciate faster. Man, that's a long discussion. Very interesting question. Sir?
So this is a little bit off to the side, but it's the same thing. I read about horizontal gene transfer through various viruses. I read about lack of oxygen bring about cave fish with no eyes and a few other things. And I read about other animals with various changes in diet. And apparently speciation results out of this. That's in quotes. And it's always fascinated me back to Jacob's peeled sticks. And you kind of hinted at it, like perhaps there was some drug or some other thing that resulted in some of the changes. And I'm looking at both of these things. I wonder how broad is the change? Is it just change in skin, or is it you see or melanin or whatever? And then of course the thing I was alluding to back with the viral horizontal gene transfer. How big of that impact does it have on any of this?
That was a whole lot of questions in one. I have to get back to epigenetics also. I forgot about that part. Horizontal gene transfer happens in bacteria. There are examples of it happening in higher organisms where, there are viruses that when we're infected with those viruses, they intercalate into our genome. We're carrying around we catch an infection. HIV is classic. The HIV virus will stick its genome into your genome, which is why it's so hard to get rid of it. The viruses keep on popping out later on because you're carrying the DNA. So that's hard. That would be horizontal gene transfer if a piece of DNA from the last victim carried over with it and inserted into your genome. I saw something in Science magazine this morning. I didn't read it yet. I might even have it opened up on a tab here. A horizontal gene transfer between snakes and frogs. The frogs picking up snake DNA. What? I have to read this. I don't believe it, but I have to read it. But mostly we don't see wholesale sucking up of DNA from one type of organism to another type of organism. That's not how biology works. But there can be some transfer of some DNA. And over thousands of years, I kind of expect it to happen more often now than it would have maybe in the past, that things are breaking down. So it's possible that a coral that's harboring millions of algal cells in its tissue, and it's there all this time, all of creation. Well, it's possible that some of the DNA from that algae leaked out and got into a coral cell. Okay, I'll be fine with that.
Another question.
We'll get there.
Thank you very much. It's been really thought-provoking and
good. That was my intent.
Stirring up a lot of the synapses here. But my question comes on the Barrowmans, and both evolution would seem to argue for ever-expanding species numbers-wise, yet the fossil record reflects the exact opposite, where we had at early times many species or Barrowmans or whatever, and they are only decreasing as we see today.
The fossil record reflects an unbelievable amount of diversity, most of which was lost at the flood. Only a few things survived, therefore we are depauperate in species compared to the fossil record. There's less genetic diversity of all the different created kinds. If the created kinds survived, a lot of them didn't even survive. So it's possible that the created kinds have lost the ability to speciate as much as they did before. So maybe we're not going to see new species of dogs popping up. Maybe they're done. Maybe that's all you get. Maybe you get horses and zebras and Przalski's horse, and that's it. Maybe there's not going to be any more. We used to have woolly mammoths and mastodons, and now all we have is African and Asian elephants. Now all we have is African and Asian elephants. We used to have rhinoceroses whose horns came up and made a T. We don't see those anymore. So yeah, there's less genetic diversity. Part of that's the curse. Part of that's just things dying over time and struggling, and subpopulations going extinct, which especially the larger animals, we see that a lot. It's not contradictory to think that there's less diversity now than there was. This is just I'm sorry, I flipped over to my slide. It's just a general model of change over time. So maybe I should, I had 5 there and 3 there, so actually I did show it accidentally. Okay.
Okay, another question.
Sir.
Hi, on your Y chromosome diagram that you showed the other night, I think you said group R2 was Native Americans, whichever group it was.
Group Q is Native American.
Okay. Have you compared that to Mormonism's theory of the origin of Native Americans?
I was just reading some stuff on Mormonism and genetics, and they are really struggling to defend what the Book of Mormon says about the history of the Native Americans. Oh no, they say, not all the people in America are descended from the tribes of Israel. No, that's what the Book of Mormon says. Oh no, it doesn't say all. Okay. But how about 0? Because there's 0 evidence genetically that any of them are descended from any of the tribes of Israel. Oh, well, and the conversation goes in circles. There is, genetically, the Bible stands tall. There's abundant evidence of a single dispersal of people across the planet with one Y chromosome ancestor or one mitochondrial ancestor. Clear. The Book of Mormon and etc. The Book of Mormon just falls on its face. It makes some huge claims that they're not supported archaeologically, and they're not supported genetically, and they're not supported linguistically. So there's nothing to talk about. That doesn't happen when you're talking about the Bible. When the Bible talks about archaeology, literally people have been like, hey, the Bible says that this city was over there. Let's go dig. And they find it. You cannot take the Book of Mormon and put it, it's supposed to be in Central America. There's nothing in Central America that matches. However, Eastern Pennsylvania and Western New York, they fit the Book of Mormon beautifully. All he did was take his place names that he knew where he grew up and added funny endings on the names. The distances between the cities, the land between the seas, yeah, that's between the 2 Great Lakes. You go up into Canada from that spot, just go like that. And it's a 2 days horse ride. Yep. So, yeah, it's just not
currently going on. I've been doing quite a bit of reading on it. There's some very, very evil people trying to be God with this transhumanism. How familiar are you with everything that's going on with that? Basically, men wanting to be God, creating a new race, etc.
Come to my genetic engineering talk tomorrow. I'm not going to talk about creating new races, but I'm going to talk about the potential for genetically engineering humans and what the fears, the realized fears are for that. There are some possible benefits, like fixing diseases like hereditary blindness and things like that. But the brave new world is upon us, and there's no moral check. And essentially, you can do any experiment you want as long as you flush the embryo down the drain before it's 14 days old. And it's sickening. But tomorrow. Because at 14 days, the embryo has grown to the point where it's starting to develop what's called the neural crest, where your spine's going to form. And at that point, you can't separate it. So like identical twins have to happen before 14 days. Because once you have a backbone, you can't divide the embryo and you can't divide it in half along its backbone. So that's when all the ethicists have said, oh, it's permissible to experiment up to that point, and then we have to stop. Yeah. I did a whole series on my Biblical Genetics channel on fetal tissue research, and the deeper I dug, the more sick I got. And that's only a hint. That's Pandora's box. When you peek in that box, you don't want to go there.
Dr. Carter, there's been a lot of experimentation in recent years of taking genes from one species, even from one perhaps Barrowman, and transferring it to another Barrowman.
Yep.
What are the theological implications of these men who are playing God?
Yeah, like when I took the genes from these corals and engineered them into those fish and got my doctorate. Yeah, what are the theological implications of this? Good and bad. We're called to have dominion. We are told to have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. So if science is doing science specifically to further human health, that's a good thing, and fish are just fish. In fact, in this laboratory when I left, they were taking my green fluorescent protein and putting it next to genes that turn on when the fish gets cancer. They wanted a cancer model where the tumor would be fluorescent, and when it's cured, it would stop being fluorescent. That's a noble goal. One of the brilliant things about fluorescent proteins is it's the only gene you can see. The protein glows. Other proteins are invisible. So that's not a bad thing. Transgenic crops. Well, if we have to use less pesticides on a crop, that's a good thing. Less fertilizer, that's a great thing. Fertilizers are toxic. They ruin ecosystems. They decrease the quality of life, even of human beings living downstream of places where you had to put lots of pesticides and herbicides on things and fertilizers. But there are trade-offs. I mean, my issue with genetic engineering of things like that is not that it's wrong, it's we're myopic. And someday someone is going to do an experiment that gets out and it causes ecological havoc, like all the butterflies die. Because Monsanto didn't think that that was actually toxic to a butterfly. Whoops, too late. Or that gene gets into the wild population of some species and it spreads everywhere. They're talking about using something called the gene drive, which to me is terrifying. You take the CRISPR enzyme, the CRISPR system, and next to it you put a gene so that when two individuals mate, the CRISPR takes the other part of the genome and copies itself over there. And so all the offspring have 100%. It's not 50-50 like normal genetics. It's 100%. And that trait will spread through the population. They're talking about making genetically modified mice and putting them on Martha's Vineyard so that anytime a tick bites the mouse, the tick will die. and using a gene drive to make sure that it spreads throughout the population of mice. So wait a second. How do you keep the mice on that island? They got to the island in the first place. What if a mouse happens on a ship and jumps on the mainland? All of a sudden, all of North and South America, all the mice will be resistant to ticks. That's not smart. Ecologically, that could be really bad. And you can't go back. Once you open that door up, you can't go back. So there are smart things about genetic engineering and dumb things about genetic engineering. Safe and dangerous, good and bad. It's not bad to try to cure cancer. I had a friend, her father and brother died of Huntington's disease. She's a carrier. Her sister, who's one of the most beautiful people I ever met, is melting down right now. She's going insane because it affects your mind. She's angry, she's mean, she's got some kids, and she says, she knew she was a carrier before she had her children, before she got married, but she said, it's in God's hands. But likely, because it's a dominant trait, if you have one copy of it, you die, and you die young, and it's ugly. Fixing that would be a good thing.
Okay, I think this is a good time to stop the Q&A, and there's a lot more to say about genetic engineering, and he's going to say more
tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm.
Come back tomorrow. It's in Snohomish, Emmanuel Baptist Church. The directions they're on the sheet here on the back, but they're also on our website, apologeticsforum.org. Just look at upcoming events, and all the directions are on there. And the second talk, as I said, is on amazing engineering in ancient Egypt. If you want to know what Carter and other members of his team found, and you don't have time or money to take a tour, here's a place to go tomorrow morning at 10:30. So we look forward to that as well. So if you bring up the last slide, Rick, just a short description. I'm going to be speaking on 12 reasons why the Bible is unique. What sets it apart from other so-called holy books? There are about 300 holy books, so-called holy books in the world. What sets the Bible apart? What makes it true? And I've got 12 reasons why that is so. Some of them are listed there, and I'll describe them in detail there. I've given that talk actually many times overseas and different missions trips, and a number of churches around here as well. So I look forward to doing it here for the first time at the Apologetics Forum. So remember, in the outside there's the book table, both from the Apologetics Forum that we have, a number of books to the right there, and then Carter's books and CMI on the two middle tables. And take a look at those. He mentioned some of them, but there are a lot more out there. So again, there's refreshments there for those that like that as well, and take time to peruse the table there. Donation box there in the back row there, if you care to donate to the ministry and supporting speakers like Carter. So let me close in a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we come to you again this evening just to thank for CMI, Creation Ministries International, and for Dr. Carter and his ministry. We thank you for the information that he has given us here. May we be able to share that with our colleagues, our family, friends, whoever we come across, or whoever God puts in our path, Lord, and may we use that information. Thank you for this time. Pray that you just bless each one, and safe travels back home again. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. One other thing I should mention, on the back table, there's all flyers for upcoming meetings, a bunch of other information. And if you're not on our mailing list yet, there's a sign-up sheet. Just put your name and email address, and you'll be informed of other upcoming meetings. Thank you.